Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our talk. And today we are going to talk to you about our threat research methodology. And to do that, we'll use as a case study one of the most interesting investigations we've ever done, involving not one, but 3 different APT groups. But before we begin, let us introduce ourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lior Berger. I have a decade of experience with malware analysis, threat hunting, and reverse engineering malware. And over the past few years, I've been specialized specifically in tracking various nation-state threat actors, as well as cybercrime groups.
And my name is Tom Facterman. I'm a senior threat researcher for the Cortex threat research team in Palo Alto Networks, works closely with Lior, and I specialize in threat hunting and malware analysis. So what are we actually going to talk about today? First, we'll start with some background about the story and this whole investigation. We'll see what kind of challenges we faced during this investigation, and we'll talk a bit our clustering methodology. After that, we will get to the really interesting part and see what the threat actors actually did, what were the TTPs, and how we use them for our attribution methodology. And next, we'll touch upon the subject of intelligence-driven hunting and see how, by using this approach, we were able to find some very interesting insights related to this attack. And we'll end with some key takeaways that we have from this research. So let's start. So our story begins in a regular day of work where Lior and I did some threat hunting. We were looking for some exploitation of an IIS vulnerabilities. And we came across a single alert that really caught our eyes. This alert came from an environment that belongs to a government entity in Southeast Asia. Now, as you can imagine, of course, this really piqued our interest. So we immediately started to investigate, digging in, and following one breadcrumb after another, until eventually we ended up with it. And you are probably looking at that and you are thinking, what is going on over here? And believe me, we kind of felt the same way because it really was a huge incident. There were over 70 infected machines and servers. The attackers took control of sensitive assets. They had privileged users. They had domain admins. The multigograph you see in front of you is the result of weeks of hard work of gathering all the data and connecting all of the dots. But before we even got into this stage, into all of that, there were quite a few challenges in our way. Now, the first challenge, and quite the most obvious one, is that we had a lot of data. We had over 2 years worth of XDR data to go over. And when you have so much data, you start to ask, where do I even begin? How can I handle so much data? And now when you investigate such a large environment, it is obvious that there are going to be multiple kill chains in the environment. It could be ransomware, it could be different cybercrime malware, info stealers, banking trojans. And also when you're investigating an attack by an APT, there could be multiple kill chains. So we ask ourselves as analysts, how can we tell where one kill chain ends and another begins? And after some time into our investigation, we also kind of started to question ourselves because, well, some of the data kind of didn't match up for us. And we started to ask, is there really just one threat actor here? Or could there be multiple threat actors in that environment in the same time? It really became a kind of a hypothesis we needed to verify. So we understood that in order to tackle all of the challenges, what we need to do is to organize our data into clusters. And in order to do that, we worked around 3 main pillars. We looked at the tools and techniques, we looked at the kill chain, and we looked at the infrastructure. And before anyone jumps out of their chairs, let me emphasize, this is not our attribution methodology, it is our clustering methodology. We will talk about attribution later in the presentation. But what all of this actually means. So for example, let's say we saw some activity by a unique tool or malware on one machine, and a different activity by the same unique tool or malware on a different machine, we could group this activity together. If we saw multiple tools and malware who were part of the same process tree, and that were created by the same process, we could also group this activity together. And of course, if maybe we had different malware who communicating with the same unique IP address or the same unique domain, we could also cluster this activity together. So at this point, we started with weeks of meticulous work, of going over all the data that we have, and clustering it, and connecting everything together. And well, do you want to see what we ended up with? After going over the data and clustering it, we managed to find 3 distinct clusters of activity in our data. And as you can see here, sometimes they even had overlaps. On some occasions, we saw activity of multiple clusters on the same machines in overlapping times. And when we got to this conclusion, of course, we had even more questions. Who could be behind this cluster? Are there actually multiple threat actors here? Maybe it's different teams who are reporting to the same threat actor. Are they all working together? Are they even aware that they're all targeting the same environment? So in order to answer at least some of these questions, we are going to do a deep dive into each cluster and really understand what we saw over them. Now we'll start with what we call cluster A, who was the largest of the clusters, with activity going back for at least 2 years. Now, we really had a lot of data, so I'm only going to mention some of the most interesting stuff we saw in each cluster. And one of the really first things that really caught our eyes in regard to this cluster was suspicious activity that we saw that came from an agent of ESET's remote administrator program. We saw this agent in the environment who was sign and verifying, executing some very suspicious commands on multiple machines in the environment. And also on some machines, we saw it executing a very suspicious process called conhost.exe. Its original name is pwmtower.exe. And actually, this process belongs to Trend Micro, which is a completely different antivirus company. So of course, this is a really peculiar mismatch we have here. These 2 competing antivirus companies in the same process tree. And what we actually saw is that this microprocess was actually loaded with a malicious DLL. And it was a malware that was unknown to us at the time. Now, of course, seeing all of this activity raised a lot of red flags for us that something fishy is going on over here. But we also understood how strong of a grip the threat actor had over the infected environment. I mean, they took control over one of the most sensitive assets, and an administration server of an antivirus product. Just think what a threat actor can do with such power. They can try to whitelist their files. They can create exceptions for the malware. It is a lot of power. Now, don't forget, we still have this unknown malware, and of course, we were really curious to understand what it is. And in order to do that, we needed to reverse engineer it. So we started to analyze this mysterious backdoor. And while doing so, we encountered some very interesting and indicative strings. And those strings led us to an already known malware, which was named T1 shell or Tone shell, which was first discovered by Trend Micro. So we compared the sample that we have with this already known variant of Tone shell, and what we understood is that what we encountered is an undocumented variant of the same malware. It was similar, but it had some very major upgrades. Now, first of all, the Tone shell backdoor is strongly associated with a specific threat group, a Chinese threat group known as Mustang Panda, or as we track it in Unit 42, Stately Taurus. Now, the original variants of Tone shells were created as shellcode, but the variant that we found during this attack was composed of 3 different DLL components who were working in tandem. Each one was loaded into a different process, and each one was responsible to a different functionality. There was one for persistence and executing the rest of the processes, one for networking and receiving commands from the C2, and one for functionality, doing everything the malware can do. And they were communicating with each other via named pipes. And the Tone shell backdoor can do everything you'd expect from a good backdoor, executing commands, keylogin, scan capturing, and more stuff like that. Now, also as part of cluster A, there was another very unique backdoor used, and it was the shadow-pad backdoor. And shadow-pad is a very interesting backdoor. It was initially discovered in 2015. And first, it was observed to be used by WinNT, a Chinese threat group. But since then, we are observing it being used by various different Chinese threat actors. It is very popular in different Chinese threat actors. And it is considered to be the successor of the infamous plugix malware, although plugix is still very alive and kicking. And as part of cluster A, we actually saw that it was also sideloaded into a legitimate component of an antivirus product. This time it was to a component of Bitdefender. So in here we can see a kind of a playbook that it looks like this attacker likes to use to abuse antivirus programs to hide its malware. Now, in addition to using very unique and interesting malware, we also saw that the operation of cluster A was highly targeted. We observed the threat actor using the Windows event logs to search for login events of very specific usernames inside the environment. And when we searched for who those usernames belong to, we came up with a list of various high-ranking officials who worked for this government. We had names of diplomats, names of ministers, and also names of IT workers. So when we saw that, we understood how serious of an attacker this is. I mean, they really did their homework. They did the intelligence work of gathering data about this government, gathering the relevant names, and trying to find to which machines those usernames are logged into, which are probably their own personal machines. And after that, they tried to compromise those machines. And they did all that to get to their main goal in this attack. We saw the attackers collect probably hundreds of different classified and sensitive documents as part of this operation. It was really huge, and honestly, as an analyst, it was pretty amazing to see, because you don't see exfiltration on this scale like every day. And remember doing the analysis, I told to my manager, listen, they know everything about them. And it didn't even stop here. On top of that, we saw they created a persistent script that was responsible to periodically collect files, archive them. So this way they could get a continuous flow of data over a long period of time. And in order to exfiltrate all of this data, the attackers used a Dropbox and other file hosting sites. So this is another example of how this attacker really likes to hide in plain sight, as communication through Dropbox may not appear very suspicious on first glance, at least. Okay, so now let's try and summarize everything in regards to cluster A. As part of our attribution process, we like to use a diamond model of attribution. And as part of this model, we take into account the capabilities, infrastructure, and victimology. Now, in regards to victimology, in this part, of course, we have a government in Southeast Asia. And we can have our theories about who might want to target such a government. But of course, realistically, on its own, it's really not enough. Now, as you can imagine, our first idea, I guess, that we were dealing with a Chinese threat actor came when we saw the shadow-pad backdoor, which of course is very popular with different Chinese threat actors. And of course, we also had the tone shell malware, who, up to this date, is strongly associated with a Chinese threat actor known as Mustang Panda. So of course, attribution is more of an art than actual science, but taking into account the victimology, the different capabilities and TTPs of this threat actor, and of course, different infrastructure overlap that I won't get into now, our main suspect behind cluster A is a Chinese threat actor, Mustang Panda, that we track also as Taurus, also known as Twill Typhoon and Air Spreta. And I hope I'm saying all of this right. So now we have our first piece in the puzzle, but our story, of course, is not done yet. We still need to understand who is behind cluster B and who is behind cluster C. So now I'll pass the stage to Lior to continue our story.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so let's continue and let's dive into cluster B and try to explore the main TTPs and try to understand who is behind this activity. Okay, got it. Okay, so cluster B was the second largest cluster after cluster A, and it lasted for a little bit over a year. And during this time frame, we observed a multi-wave attack tactic that each wave started with the exploitation of several web shells, servers, Exchange servers and web servers, followed by deployment of several web shells, including the notorious channel chopper web shell. Then, using those web shells, the threat actor were able to execute additional activities, such as perform reconnaissance activity and gather information about the environment and the users. They also used it to create several admin accounts and deployment of additional tools and malware in order to enhance the overall capabilities. And when we investigated this cluster, we noticed that the threat actor behind this activity was pretty elusive, and they tried to hide many of the activities that they did. And one of the things that they tried to hide is the communication with the command and control server. And to do that, they tried different tools. First, they tried to perform reverse SSH tunneling using the very known tool PuTTY. Then they also tried to use a renamed binary of the soft ether VPN, which they used not only to create communication externally with the command and control server, but also to move laterally towards different assets in the network. And third, they also tried to use the proxy tool, which is called HTRAN, again, in order to tunnel RDP connections back to the C2. And besides the use of those tools to kind of hide the activity of the communication with the command and control servers, we also noticed that this threat actor tried to deploy some completely new and undocumented malware. And of course, for us as researchers, it's also very interesting to encounter a new piece of malware. So we were quite excited about that. And among the different malware and tools that they tried to use were two undocumented .NET backdoors. The first one, we named it Rochelle, which is based on the PDP path of the malware that you can see on the screen. And Rochelle was a pretty straightforward backdoor that had some classic backdoor functionality. It was able to extract system information and also to run arbitrary commands. And as you can see on the right, the C2 was actually embedded inside the code itself. And when the threat actor executed this malware, or attempted to execute this malware, and they failed, they kind of suspected that something was wrong. So they performed some connectivity check to see if this malware is actually running and communicating with the C2. And when we find this new piece of malware, we, of course, reverse engineer it and try to understand the full capabilities and functionalities. But we also try to hunt for additional similar binaries. And there are many ways that we found that we can hunt for additional Rochelle binaries, but we wanted to share with you one method. So we found that Rochelle has actually pretty unique and distinct URI pattern that can be used for hunting, for example, using Aristotle, as you can see here on the screen. And it can also be implemented in different security solutions to protect against this threat. And as I mentioned, there were two undocumented .NET backdoors. So the second one, we named it Zapoa. And Zapoa was a bit more complex. It had more capabilities than just the straightforward capabilities that we saw with Rochelle. Zapoa was also equipped with the ability to run shellcodes, to manipulate processes and files, time-stomping files, and even loading additional .NET assemblies, which kind of gave this malware more of a modular structure. And unlike Rochelle, where the C2 was actually embedded inside the code itself, Zapoa worked a bit differently. And it basically opens an HTTP listener and waits for inbound request that matches a specific pattern and contains a specific authentication key. This is actually a very stealthy approach because this way, if one server goes down, the threat actor can just set up a new server and use that for the C2 of this malware. And another interesting fact that we noticed about this threat actor is that they really wanted to steal credentials. It was very important for them. And they tried many tools and techniques, as you can see here on the screen. This phase really showed us how determined and how adaptive these threat actors were, because they really tried to use one technique after another and try to bypass different mitigation efforts. And also, this phase really gives us, and as researchers, this glimpse to the whole cat and mouse game between adversaries and defenders, which is also very interesting for us, and we can learn a lot about it. And in addition to all the tools and malware that I kind of mentioned in more details so far, as I mentioned in the beginning, they really try to deliver additional tools to enhance the overall capabilities. And among those tools were Cobalt Strike, PowerCat, Kasarat, HDOR, Ghost Rinratch, which is a variant of the Ghost-Rat malware. And interestingly, they also tried to use the Winty malware, which is a very interesting malware that is known to be used by several Chinese threat actors. And this also kind of gave us an initial indication about the potential origin of this threat actor. And now, after we kind of covered the main TTPs of cluster B, we can move forward towards making an attribution. And same as Tom did with cluster A, we follow the diamond model of attribution to do that in this case as well. So when we had a look at the capabilities, we had this multi-wave attack tactic, and we have a lot of different tools that are commonly used by a lot of threat actors since they're open source tools or publicly available ones. And we also have two completely new and undocumented backdoors, the Zapoa and Rochelle, which of course were not attributed to any specific threat actor. So we understood that we had to kind of change perspective here and try to see if we can, have a lead to threat actor based on these capabilities. And we started to look at it as a whole, as a set of tools. And this relatively unique set of tools actually led us to a suspect, which is called the gallium threat actor. So gallium are known to be or associated with the Chinese government, and they usually target telco communication company and governmental entities, and they operate mainly in Europe, in Africa, and in Asia, with a specific interest in Southeast Asia. And when we had a look at the infrastructure, we have found that one of the IPs that we saw in this attack actually overlaps with a known gallium infrastructure. And this really strengthened our initial assumption that we are dealing here with this threat actor. And of course, we cannot forget about the victimology. So our victimology was government in Southeast Asia, which of course aligned with the victimology of gallium. And after we took into consideration all the different artifacts, we concluded that the threat actor behind this activity is most likely the gallium APT group, or as we track it in Unit 42, Alloy Taurus, also known as Granite Typhoon. Great, so now we have the second piece in the puzzle, but of course, our work is not done yet. We still need to understand who is behind cluster C. So let's dive right into it. So cluster C was the shortest and also the smallest of the three clusters, and it lasted for about 6 months. And during this time frame, we observed a two-wave attack tactic, again, kind of similar to what we saw with cluster B. And each wave started with the exploitation of Exchange servers, followed by the deployment of several web shells. Then, using those web shells, the threat actor were able to perform additional activities, such as reconnaissance activities, moving laterally via SMB, and deployment additional tools and malware, again, to enhance the overall capabilities. And when we first investigated this cluster, we found that the threat actor tried to use a lot of tools and malware that were open source or publicly available. So we didn't have like an initial lead about who might be behind this. But as we dived into this, we actually got quite lucky, and we found two custom and very unique malware that were used in this cluster. And these malware are Session Manager and OAuth-Proxy. And each one of them is quite unique on its own and very rare, and was only reported used a handful of times. Session Manager and OAuth-Proxy, they are both IIS backdoors that allow the threat actor to upload and download files and also to run arbitrary commands. Session Manager allows the threat actor to tunnel internal communication over proxy, and OAuth-Proxy allowed to tunnel external communication to the C2 over different ports like HTTP and HTTPS. And again, each one of them is quite unique on its own and very rare to encounter. But what was extremely interesting in our case is actually the combination of these two malware in a single attack. And this combination is actually very rare. It was reported only once before in an attack against several entities in Laos. And this attack was attributed back then to a group called Gelsemium. I really hope I'm pronouncing it right. So this kind of gave us an initial lead about who might be behind this activity as well. And unfortunately for the threat actors, not everything goes smooth. And when they tried to execute and run all proxy, it got blocked. So they had to come up with a new solution or try to use a different malware. And as a result, they indeed kind of shifted towards trying to use another tool, and they shifted into using Earthworm. So Earthworm is a publicly available SOX tunneler that is available on GitHub and was initially created for research purposes, but like many other good tools, kind of gained popularity among Chinese-speaking threat actors. And the threat actor used this tool in order to tunnel remote communication with the C2 over different ports. So now after we kind of covered the main TTPs in cluster C, and again, it was the shortest and the smallest cluster of the three, we can move forward towards trying to make an attribution and try to understand who is behind this activity. And same as we did with the other two clusters, we followed the diamond model of attribution. And when we had a look at the capabilities and the infrastructure, we had these two malware session manager and null proxy that kind of gave us an initial indication about who might be behind this activity. And when we examined publicly available reports about them, as well as our internal telemetry, we found that these two malware were only being reported used by a single threat actor. And this is the Gelsemium group. And also when we checked the infrastructure, we also found an overlap with another incident also attributed to the Gelsemium group. And although this group has been active since at least 2014, there are not many reports about them, and they kind of stayed under the radar for a long period of time. But from the available reports, we found out that this group actually targets a very high value target, and they specifically operates around Asia, which of course aligned with our findings as well. And based on the different artifacts that we concluded here, we came to a conclusion that the threat actor behind the cluster C is most likely the Gelsemium group. And although this group was again active for a few years, they were not formally attributed to any specific country, at least not by the researchers who first discovered it. But it is interesting to mention that different vendors, including a CERT organization, actually claims that this group has some links to China, which makes everything even more interesting. Great. So now we have our final missing piece in the puzzle. And at this point, we kind of assumed that our investigation came to an end. We have a very interesting research. We have this single government that was targeted by 3 different APTs, like a very interesting blog to write. But we kind of felt like there is something even bigger going on here. In order to see if it's actually true and to see the bigger picture, we had to have a broader look at the findings. And to do that, we followed an approach that we like to call intelligence-driven hunting. So intelligence-driven hunting is basically a complementary approach to generic threat hunting, but it's more threat-centric or threat-focused, and of course, it's integrated with intelligence. It's more accurate, but of course, it's more time-consuming and more expensive. And we use that when we want to hunt for specific threats that are relevant to a specific organization, specific industry, or even a specific region. And intelligence-driven hunting really gives us the much-needed context. It helps us to understand or to distinguish one evil from another, set the severity, prioritization of which threat we should handle first, and of course, it helps us with attribution. So following this approach, we created hunting queries that were based on the main TTPs that we saw in each one of the clusters. They were, of course, based on the IOCs and the infrastructure that we found, which we kind of like to call low-hanging fruits. But they were mostly based on the behavioral patterns and the other TTPs that we observed. It can be process tree of web server exploitation, specific username that are created, specific file names, and everything that we could extract from our investigation. Then we went back to our telemetry and we ran those hunting queries. And soon after that, we found out that we were indeed dealing here with a much bigger story. We found evidence of 8 additional governmental entities that were compromised by similar activities. And what was even more interesting is that all of them actually belonged to the same government. We had entities from critical infrastructure, public healthcare facilities, financial administrations, public transportations, and other very critical entities. So at this point in the investigation, we understood that we are not dealing here with just one governmental entity that was compromised, but rather almost 10 different entities. So this was quite a big moment in our investigation. And let's try to wrap up everything that we just discovered and try to see the bigger picture here. So as you may remember, we started this investigation by discovering this single government an entity that was compromised by 3 different clusters. Let's add to it now what we just learned after following the intelligence-driven hunting. So we found additional entities that were compromised with activities that are similar to cluster B, and some entities that were compromised by activities related to both cluster A and cluster B. So at this point, we understood that we actually have these 2 clusters that kind of spreads across multiple entities of the same government in Southeast Asia. And there is something very interesting connecting these 2 clusters. These 2 clusters believed to be operating on behalf of China. And I mean, it's not a secret that many countries use cyber espionage to advance their political and their military agendas, like everyone is doing it nowadays. But it's not every day that you come across such a case where you see such a comprehensive grip of one nation, in our case, China, over another nation. Just think about the overall potential of such an attack. Think if it was the United States and Russia, for example. And on that positive note, I'm gonna finish with the key takeaways since we need to wrap up. I really hope you'll find it interesting and of course useful in your work as well. The very first thing that we kind of learned or got a good reminder of regarding this incident is that things are not always as they seem. The fact that you see malicious activity coming from the same environment, around the same time frame, even around the same machines, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same threat actor. It doesn't even mean that it's a single threat actor. We also got a pretty good reminder to really pay attention to details, because paying attention to details is a very crucial part in the clustering process that Tom talked about, and also in the attribution process. We also learned that sometimes the greatest findings that we got and we discovered were actually drawn from the smallest detail. This case is also a really good reminder that APTs can remain undetected for a long period of times, even years. We know that APTs are very capable groups. They're well-resourced, and they can stay under the radar for a long period of time. And even after being remediated, they tend to leave many doors behind them, and they tend to make a comeback. And that kind of led me to the last key takeaway, which is the importance of intelligence-driven hunting. We believe that the best approach to detect and to protect against these sophisticated threats is to perform periodical hunting sessions that are integrated with intelligence. So when they do try to make this comeback, we'll be able to find them and, of course, to stop them as soon as possible. And that's kind of concluded our session today. Thank you so much for listening to us. And if you want to learn more, you can find a 4-part blog about this that really dives into each cluster. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but we'll be happy to answer.